Welcome to another edition of Thought Leaders Live, where we talk with thought leaders in business, life, and all points in between. Today, joined by an old buddy of mine, Paul Kishy. Did I get that one right?
Hey, Greg.
Paul
Yeah,
Kishy.
you got it right. Nice.
We're just, Paul, can you slide over just a little to the right? There you go. Paul and I were chatting about how many times our respective names have been mispronounced over the years. So we're bonding on through that. But I've known Paul for a long time. Fantastic branding work, graphic designer, illustrator, artist, who has really done a lot of amazing work in the manufacturing and marketing in general. And Paul, really excited to have you on the show today.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to be here. This is going to be fun. And
Yeah.
thanks for the intro.
Yeah, of course. So today we're going to talk about branding tips for inbound wins. And I think it's kind of an interesting title, Paul, that you picked. Normally you just hear the branding from a lot of creatives, but you're also talking about inbound. And so that immediately signals to me we're talking about marketing too. So
Sure.
not just a brand for brand's sake, but also to get those inbound wins. So I'm excited for the topic today.
Yeah, I wanted to really emphasize the inbound because I think I was inspired by your company name, Winbound. So just wanted to, emphasize that for the inbound links.
Yeah, nice. Well, we appreciate it. And why don't we start out though, Paul? I know all about you, but always happy to learn more. And so is everybody who's tuning in. So why don't you give us a little bit of background about yourself and how Aviate Creative came to be and what you guys are doing?
Sure. I never know how much to go into. I want to make sure we don't just talk about that. But I've been an artist my whole life. Was a designer and an art director and creative director for lots of firms in New York, Philadelphia, New Jersey area. Started my own company about just over 20 years ago. Um, so we've been focused primarily on manufacturing and technology companies. We do, graphic design, branding. We do writing work. We do a wide spectrum of any kind of print materials, that kind of stuff. And I'm also a professor in graphic design. I'm a fine artist. I'm a professional illustrator. So I just kind of ride the full spectrum of commercial art to a large degree.
Yeah. And so 10 years now, did you say 10 for Aviate?
20. 20
20.
years. Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, no problem.
Wow. That is quite an accomplishment. That's amazing. So
Yeah,
why don't we jump into just a little bit about branding and your kind of philosophy and how you approach branding for companies?
sure. I think branding might be the confusing term for some people. So branding isn't just a logo. Branding isn't just your product. Branding is a lot of stuff. So branding is going to incorporate your company name, your positioning within the marketplace, the sound of your company, the voice, the tone. It's going to be your color palette. It's going to be your your product and your packaging. So it's a wide variety of stuff that basically represents your company to the world. And um, I wanted to talk about today about how branding impacts the inbound links, because a lot of people will put focus on that inbound, or they'll put focus on outbound sales, but they don't really put focus on the branding. And so when somebody comes in, they're going to see that logo first. They're going to see that website first. That's all part of your branding. And if it's a bad first impression, uh, it doesn't really matter how much work you're doing with the inbound or outbound sales. If they come in and it's a bad first impression, they're not going to stick around. It's not going to convert. So branding is going to help qualify your company. It's going to help convert that company.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I always kind of think of branding almost in terms of people. You know, I know Paul Kishi. I know what he's like. I know his
Mm.
personality. I mean, I have your brand, your personal brand in my head. And I think when we meet people, after we get to know them, their personalities ring true to us, and we know who they are and what they're like. And but that all starts with that, like you said, that first impression, the visuals,
Mhm.
what they look like, how they're acting to us immediately out of the gates. And so I think you're right, especially, in marketing, it's like that. You get that much opportunity. So somebody comes in, I think I read somewhere that design is one of the biggest elements in the conversion process. So getting somebody to convert from a visitor to a lead, it's really, really important.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you have like what, 2 to 3 seconds to set that a first impression. People these days going online they just don't have patience. So, if they don't think they're in the right place, if they think that the company's too amateurish or too small or whatever impression that you make, that's going to set in very, very quickly, and they're going to bounce very quickly, or they're going to start making assumptions right away and say, this company is this way, so I'm gonna avoid them, or no, this looks professional, this looks clean, they look like the kind of company that I want to work with. And it's personality too. Like, I like how you connected a personal brand and a personal persona with branding. Companies have a persona, companies have a personality. So companies are going to be, you know just as impacted as meeting like a person, maybe more.
Yeah,
You're going to be a lot more judgmental very quickly about a
yeah,
company.
because you're spending your money with them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about um, the things that people do right with branding and the things they do wrong. Why don't we start out in the positive vein? What makes a good brand, Paul?
Well, a good brand is memorable. So you want to make sure that it stands out, it's differentiated, so that way it doesn't just blend in. So, this question of what do they do right and what do they do wrong is it's kind of tied together, right? So it's, if they are doing that wrong, they're making something that is not memorable. They're making something that's forgettable. Maybe they're blending in too much. Maybe they're too generic. And if they're doing it right, they're having a distinct mark that stands out, that's memorable, that sticks in your brain quite a bit, right? You want a brand for the future. You want to make sure that you're looking towards what you want to be, not just necessarily where you are now. So when you're branding, you want to think about where your company's going to be in the next 3 to 5 years, or even further into the future than that. You want to really solidify customer loyalty, and really try to make sure that people build trust and credibility, um, really kind of build on that reliance of that brand. If you look at like any major brand like McDonald's or Nike, whatever, people are buying trust. They're buying the fact that they see that brand. They know that every time they go to McDonald's, that burger is going to taste the same, or they think it's going to taste the same. That soda is going to always be the same, that kind of thing. And so, um, you know, they could go anywhere for a burger, but they're going to go to that place that they know, they trust, and it's consistent each time. So
Yeah,
consistency is another thing that people do wrong. Is they mix up the way that things are treated, they mix up their colors, they mix up the way that their brand is perceived, and therefore that instills a lack of consistency, and that lack of consistency translates into lack of trust. So it's all kind of connected that way.
let's talk a little bit about differentiation, especially this is, to me, is really difficult with manufacturers. And
Mm.
let me throw this out at you, Paul. This is my theory. Manufacturers are sales driven companies, and primarily, and a lot of them have been built on the salespeople getting out there and establishing relationships. So those personal brands have been what's landed the deal.
Mm,
Now you're trying to market them though compared to the competition and in establishing a brand online and a brand in trade pubs and things like that. That's a little different than those personal relationships, right? And so I always find that a lot of manufacturers are just trying to do what their competition is doing and just trying to like, well, they've got this, so we've got to have the same thing, you know. Um, but they're not quite getting that differentiation. Do you find that's the
absolutely.
case
Yeah,
with
absolutely.
manufacturers?
A lot of them play it too safe, and safe is like a bad word when it comes to differentiation and branding. You don't want to play it so safe because then you just blend in. You're just like everybody else. The amount of manufacturers that have blue brands is crazy. Like every single company wants a blue brand, and it's just you just blend right in. They all kind of want the same. If you look at the trend of logos, a lot of them have kind of gone in the trend of having the same look across the board, and that's such a mistake because you just end up looking the same as everybody else. So why would somebody pick your company over the competition? Now you just lost the opportunity of branding making that difference, where branding could pull a lot of weight when it comes down to that decision making. It's when you blend in too much and don't differentiate, it's not going to do that. Um, you know, I find that manufacturers can be more differentiated than they want to be. I agree with your comment that um, they often are looking to mimic their competition. I always think it's better to go beyond the competition, set a new standard, let the competition kind of chase you and see, where they can go. And we often see that when we rebrand a company that all of a sudden they're no longer anywhere near their competition, that they're so far above. And then all of a sudden their competition starts to try and mimic them a little bit and stuff. Um, but, if you're doing it well enough, it takes a lot for that company to be mimicked. Um, differentiation can be done a lot of different ways, but one of the things it depends on what kind of manufacturing you're talking about. So some manufacturing is um, more commodity driven, and that's really difficult to distinguish. Where you see just differentiation there often is in the customer service, is in the way that their lead time. So you're looking towards like their service model stuff based rather than their actual product. But there are a lot of manufacturers that are differentiated by their product, and you want to emphasize what makes them different, what makes them better, and kind of try to let your branding kind of speak to some of that stuff. A lot of them have very generic names. They have acronyms or they have names that are named after a person. Those are all very forgettable. So that's a lost opportunity as well. Is that a lot of manufacturers don't have a name that's memorable or powerful, and they're just based on some kind of history.
Let's talk for that for a second. You said named after a person is
Mhm.
forgettable. I always thought that would be kind of the opposite, like more than like, industrial automation. That's gonna like boom, go right over. But
Well, yeah,
if I say
yeah,
tissue,
if you're talking about something very generic that way,
yeah,
your name's going to be a little bit more unique and stuff like that. But it's not attached to any kind of memory. It's not attached to any kind of um, signaling of any kind of verbiage that's going to bring in some kind of memory or thought process or anything like that. So I agree that if you just go with some kind of super generic industrial, you know
yeah.
rivet company, whatever, that's super generic. So you have to be creative with your naming. You can't just do that. But um, sometimes those can be very confident sounding, though. If you are super generic, sometimes it can come across very confident because it can come across as though you're like the established leader in the industry. Although I wouldn't recommend going too generic. I would say there's ways to make that more unique and pull that
Okay.
together.
While back we talked and you brought up some things about when is it time to rebrand and when's it time to update your brand. Can you talk a little bit about that? When do people really maybe they had a brand for really strong back in the 80s and the
Right.
90s and the I'm dating myself here. The 2010s. When's it time to refresh the brand?
That's a great question, and I think a lot of companies are going to have a hard time figuring that out for themselves. They deal with what's called brand blindness, where you've seen it so much that you forget, to even think about it anymore. So I think it's important to try and look at it from an outside perspective to say, you know, if I was looking at this fresh with new eyes, what would this look like? And then it's important to ask outsiders what their opinion is, not necessarily just your spouse, but try and get an outside perspective. Ask your customers, ask your prospects what they think of it. But let's just say, like, if your brand is from the 70s, 80s, 90s, whatever, it's probably looking that way.
Yeah,
It's gonna look like it's back in the olden days, and that perception of a dated brand is going to translate into the perception of your products. So people are going to see a brand that looks like it's from the 70s. They're going to think, well, this company hasn't changed anything. They're not
right.
innovative. They're probably dying. They're probably exiting soon. They're just going to make assumptions that your brand and your company are going the way of the dinosaur, instead of staying fresh. So if you are saying, well, we're putting out cutting edge products, we're doing stuff for SpaceX, and we're doing stuff for all of these cool cutting edge uses. Well, your branding needs to reflect that. If your branding looks like it's from the 90s, so is your company. If your branding looks amateurish, so does your company. So if
Right.
you don't want to look like a bunch of college kids, putting together stuff, whatever, and you want to look like you're a professional organization and you're cutting edge, then your branding needs to reflect that. It's a true reflection of what it is, regardless if that's true or not. Um, Fascinating thing is the companies that come to us and say we want to look bigger than we are. So sometimes I'll get people that come to me and say, "How did you land that company? They're so big or whatever." I'm like, "No, they're not. They're like a 5-person company. We
You
just
did your
branded
job.
them to look like, yeah, we did our job. That's right. We just branded them to look that way." So a lot of times, the branding can change the perception of how successful or how big or how uh, good of a quality their products are and that stuff. So it's heavily about perception.
Yeah, for sure. Um, Tell me a little bit about in are there some specific branding make mistakes that you see that create some friction in the buying process, or are you thinking more just in general terms?
I think it's probably both. So let me see. Um, Branding mistakes that, I think having an outdated brand, like we had already talked about, is a big mistake. Um, I'm trying to think of what else.
I mean, I always see the website coming to a landing page and coming to a website and not having that thing updated. Um, not it's not just your
Yes.
logo, it's the whole site and how it performs.
Absolutely. Anything outdated, if there's spelling mistakes, if there's just a mess, if you're talking about the site, there's lots of cues right there, right? A lot of people don't check their sites, so they have outdated forms or outdated links and they don't work. So double check your links, double check your forms, make sure that when somebody comes to your site within the first 1 to 3 seconds, they know where they are and what you guys do and what you sell. I think a lot of companies, especially big ones, speak in really generic terms because they don't want to like narrow themselves down. But then you ever get to a site and you're just like, I I read this 5 times and I still don't know what the hell they do. It's like you got to be careful with that. They like write in such an abstract format
Yeah.
that it makes it very confusing, and I don't think that's helping anybody. Um, so, but then there's other sites that are illegible where you go onto it and you're just like you can barely read what they're doing, and that's really unprofessional looking and stuff. Um, but I think having brands that are too generic, too boring, they're blending in, they're not standing out at all. All of that stuff is going to be problematic for companies.
Now, in the show description, we said practical ways to improve your website messaging, visual identity. Do you have some practical ways to share with us, Paul?
Yeah, there's some simple things that we could talk about. Yeah, of course, on my side of things, if you can redo your logo or redo your name or go through your positioning, that's not practical though. Those are bigger ticket items, right? So if we want to talk about smaller things you could do, one thing would be to simplify. A lot of people just keep adding and adding and adding. And I would say go onto your site, go onto your messaging, go onto your marketing and simplify it, clean it up, reduce, 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 and keep it into a very simplified format. Remove anything that's not adding to the very specific story that you want to tell. Improve on your consistency. So if you have create a color palette that's consistent all throughout everything, create fonts that are consistent throughout everything. Make sure that you have consistent alignment, consistent spacing. Consistency across the board is going to help um, significantly in that professionalism. One easy thing that helps things look a little more professional and less cluttered is opening up space. So just having more space between sections, more space between paragraphs, more space between lettering and stuff like that's going to help with that a lot. Um, for God's sakes, spell check your work. That's unbelievable how many times people are misspelling things on things like that. But there's also things that you could do to build trust and reliability by adding, credible reports onto your site that talk about the testing. You could add testimonials from clients to make sure that that builds trust there. Um, you want to make sure things are up to date with, how you're. So a lot of people just kind of set and forget their website. So making sure that your website is still updated with the latest information, latest products. You don't want someone to call up and ask a question and be like, "Oh, that's so outdated." That
Yeah.
what do that's a mistake. So, it's just a spectrum of things like that.
Okay. You mentioned blue brands before. Is that just brands with the color blue in it, or what did you mean?
Oh, yeah, that's what I was talking about. Is just in general, the amount of manufacturers. I would say any company, but you see, if I was to say about finance, everybody chooses a green company. So you look throughout that industry and it's just all green logos, all green companies. But then when you look at manufacturing and you look at a lot of other companies, you're going to look at and see just a ton of blue.
Okay.
So it's not necessarily wrong to have a blue site. We do lots of blue brands, but if you're trying not to blend in and you're trying to stand out, you may want to try something else. That doesn't mean that you have to go to like hot pink, right? Like a lot of people are like, well, I don't want a pink brand, There are lots of things in between blue and pink. But I would tell you that if you did hot pink, you would stand out, right? People would notice it pretty quickly. But there's lots of ways to stand out, a yellow brand or orange brand, and really almost any color besides blue or black is going to stand out, significantly besides the blue. But I tell you, that's a losing battle on my side because the amount of owners that are just require blue is just crazy. It's
That's funny.
I
Is
think
there
I think it's an insecurity thing there going on.
Yeah,
So
well, I noticed, you've got blue in your logo and
that's
I've
right.
got blue in
That was
mine. So
intentional.
what's
That
that?
was intentional, because if you look at the way I looked at it at the time, because I used to have a brand that was black and gold, um, and we intentionally went blue because we knew that so many companies wanted blue that they would
Yeah,
see our brand, relate to it, and say, "Hey, that looks like a company that I like," kind of thing.
yeah,
So in our case, I think it made a lot of sense, but
yeah,
um,
very
yeah,
strategic. Well,
yeah.
just a little bit more on the colors. I've read just in passing certain colors
Mhm.
mean certain things. Do you subscribe to
Certainly.
that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt that psychologically, certain colors signal certain things. When you see red, it's obvious that it's going to be, related to danger, anger, food. There's, different types of psychological connections to that. So you do have to be careful with that, but that can also work to your advantage. If you work with a manufacturer that does, fire safety, whatever, you can certainly work within red spectrum and so forth, But I would say most of the manufacturers that we work with do not have some psychological tie to a color, so they have a little bit more freedom to work within that. And that's what I was saying before. Like green usually is like money or environmental. So there's like different types of psychological things it connects with. But as long as it's not a negative, you don't want to have a color that somehow signals the wrong thing. But other than that, it's not that strict, I don't think.
W- Paul, I, I, I'm thinking about branding and I'm thinking about colors, and you've done this for over 20 years. Not even that's 20 years in your company. You've done it longer than that. You've probably had so many meetings with so many people who I always feel like when it comes to visuals and branding, it's so subjective, it's so qualitative, and it's like, what's your personal taste? And sometimes you've got people who are making some decisions, and it might not be what you consider the right ones, and they might be making some really out there calls. How do you deal with that? I mean, how do you personally deal with that when you've got a client who's like way out of bounds?
Yeah.
And for the marketing people out there who have to present branding ideas to management, and they've got a CEO who might have some pretty crazy tastes out
Yeah.
there, something that isn't
It
in line with.
happens.
Yeah, how do you deal with
It
it?
happens, yeah. I mean, listen, they're coming to me because we're professionals. We've been doing this a long time. If they don't want to take any advice or whatever, they're probably wasting their money in the wrong spot. So I'm going to be very honest with them and I'm going to educate them. Like, I'm going to give you an example of exactly what you're talking about, where we had a company come to us. And maybe she's listening, I don't know, but she was the daughter of the owner, and she had very, very unique specific tastes. She wanted a watercolor logo, which right off the bat, that's not an easy thing to achieve, because you're talking about like a digital logo that needs to go on a lot of materials. But they were a hardwood flooring company, and what does a watercolor logo have to do with hardwood flooring? I don't know. In fact, it's almost sending the opposite message that you want to do. And so we had them do a mood board and show lots of examples of what it was that they were looking for. And then we did ours, and we said, listen, we appreciate like what you're trying to go for. We can do that, but just so you know, like, this is what the direction we were going to go with, and this is why. And we educate them, and education is really the key word here, right? So instead of just saying no or something like that, we really want to walk them through the positives and negatives of what they're asking for. And ultimately, she went with our direction, which was much more of like a monogram type of direction, which ended up being really successful. They still have that logo to this day, and they abandoned the watercolor look completely. So that one worked to our worked to our advantage. I would say if we see something that is just completely the wrong decision, and make it's going to ultimately hurt the client, we'll walk away from it if we have to, because it's not worth us going down the wrong way and then finding out what we already know, which is going to be that it's a disaster. But that's very rare. I would say most of the time we can convince them, at least meet somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
um, you know but
I,
it's definitely a challenge, and it's a lot of opinion based comments
sure.
that you have to deal with and stuff. So
Well, I
that's something
always,
that we always
when
face.
I start getting into a situation where we're kind of at odds, or we're, was it at loggerheads? I
Mhm.
um I always just say, hey, listen, I don't know everything. Why don't we test it? Let's let
Mm.
the customer decide. But I don't know how you can do that in some of these branding rollouts. Do you have any
You
kind
have to
of?
be careful with that. Yeah. So there are some companies will do testing, and you could do big market research focus groups and testing that way. It's going to cost a lot more money to do like professional testing,
Yeah,
and ultimately, what I always warn people is that when you do testing, you generally will get a safe response. And back to my earlier comment, is safe in branding is not safe. It's actually dangerous to play it too safe.
Yeah.
So if we present 3 logos or 10 logos to a focus group, they will generally pick the safest choice, and that's usually the most boring choice. And the
Interesting.
most boring choice is usually not the right choice for branding.
Yeah.
So I usually try to talk people out of focus groups and stuff.
Yeah.
I get a kick out of it because my wife is a senior VP in a market research company, so she does lots of focus groups and lots of different kinds of
It
polling and
costs her
stuff like that.
business, Paul.
uh, yeah, where was I going with that? But she, she's seen so many times where um, an owner will do testing and they'll repeat the testing over and over again just to get the answer that they want, which is not good, right? Like if you're gonna do testing, like you might as well at least believe in the responses that you get, so if you're not going to listen to it and you're going to go with your choice anyway, then save your money and just choose the logo that you're going to go with your gut,
Yeah.
yeah,
All right, Paul. Great conversation. We're at the top of
yeah.
the hour. If somebody wants to work with Aviate and with you, Paul, how do they get in touch with you?
So our website is probably the easiest way, aviatecreative.com. My email address, or you can send to our regular email address, is hello@aviatecreative.com. You can find us on almost all the social platforms under Aviate Creative. So we're pretty easy to find. And then on LinkedIn, that's always a good place to connect as well.
So at the very least, go to Paul's ABA Creative's website and check out some of their work. It's really
Thank you.
fantastic. Yeah. Paul, thanks for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks, Greg. I appreciate
Yeah.
your time.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us in another edition of Thought Leaders Live.